Good morning, everybody. It's Cowpimp here to go ahead and take a look through somebody's POB paste bin. They came in one of my build guide threads and asked for some advice running a build that was very similar to one that I posted. It's an Earthquake Juggernaut. And I told him I'd take a look at it and ask if I could use his POB in a video and just go through and offer my suggestions. So here it is. First of all, before we get started, I just want to mention that there will be some natural scaling that occurs just as you level up. My character was like level 96 or 97, so you gain another 16 or 17 levels here. You will get quite a few more passive skill points to spend on the tree, and then additionally, your skill gems will level up another couple levels. Ideally, you get yourself a level 21 Veil Earthquake, though it's less important for you than for casters, it's still significant, and any other level 21s that you can. And your damage will go up a pretty decent amount just from those things alone. So you can expect some noticeable damage boosts, really without changing anything except just progressing as anyone else would in the game. The other thing is that you don't have your last 2 ascendancy points here, so getting those 2 ascendancy points will make a noticeable difference, considering that you have currently 8 endurance charges, and I advise that you go up to 9 or 10. Since you're using a Tidebreaker, you get a pretty significant damage boost. It'll be 64 to 80% depending on how many endurance charges you have in increased damage from this node right here. So just leveling up is going to do a pretty good amount for you. But with all that in mind, I still have plenty of suggestions for you, so let's get to it. The first thing that I'm going to recommend is for your weapon. So currently you are running on a 5 link, so obviously you want to go to a 6 link. I'm sure you kind of already knew that, but just pointing out that it's one of the more efficient upgrades you can make. It's kind of expensive, but for the amount of damage that you get out of it, it's actually a fairly efficient upgrade. A lot of times people are paying, multiple exalted for jewels that are giving 5% more damage than, like a 3 property jewel that you can find that's decent to go to like a really good 4 property jewel, something like that. So the kind of upgrade you get from going 5 to 6 link is actually a lot more efficient than people think, even though it's kind of expensive. The other thing I would say is that your weapon actually has kind of poor rolls on it. So your Tidebreaker right here, I believe the bottom end roll is 70 to 80, so you're right in the middle, and the top end is like 340 to 375 or 380. So the higher end of the 2 damage rolls is actually kind of poor. So you can get something like a 10% plus damage boost by doing that, and then eventually after 6 linking it, getting the quality up to 30% through the Beast Corruption option, which is what I did. Because my Tidebreaker was like 500 DPS, and it says yours is 438. So that is more than a 10% damage boost from getting just a better rolled Tidebreaker and getting it up to 30% quality. So those are some pretty money changes you can make right there. The next thing, and this is probably even sort of cheaper and more efficient, is reworking your auras. So currently you're using Vulnerability, Link to Blasphemy, and Herald of Purity. Herald of Purity is a poor choice for a setup like this, and the reason why is because compared to your base damage, the amount of extra flat physical damage that Herald of Purity is adding is not all that high, at least not compared to other options that are out there as far as what you can get for 25% mana reservation, especially with some of the new stuff that came out. So as it is, I don't think it's that efficient. You would actually get more from just running War Banner than running this, even right now, with absolutely no other changes. That would scale your damage better all by itself. Not even counting Adrenaline, just the percent increased physical damage taken would be enough to do it. But my suggestion is that, first of all, you eliminate the mana reservation cost of Vulnerability by getting yourself an Impresence, physical damage Impresence Shaper Amulet. They probably will be more expensive this league than others, but usually they're common enough that the price gets extremely reasonable, and it frees up 35% mana to be reserved. As well, it's a good amulet. It gives you a lot of good stats. It's got life, it's got armor, it's got a nice flat physical damage roll on it, and it also has the temporary defensive buff that you get from killing rares or maybe uniques too. So it's just a good amulet as well for a setup like yours that scales armor, life, and physical damage. So you free up that 35%, you get rid of Herald of Purity, and now we're working with a full 100% unreserved mana pool. So first of all, the Pride Aura is insane. Pride Aura gives up to something like 40% more physical damage taken, which is really, really massive. So I would highly recommend that you run Pride. It's probably going to be the single biggest damage boost you can get. As well, in conjunction with that, you want to run the new aura Flesh and Stone and link that to Maim. It's going to reserve another 28% of your mana, but it's going to give something like 25 or 30% increased physical damage. I think it's like 30% increased physical damage taken, which is massive. Depending on how much other increased physical damage taken you have, it's going to be anywhere from like 20 to 30% more damage. So really, really strong. Highly recommend that you go that route, and then because you can do the stance swapping thing, when you're in Sand stance, it actually gives a really, really nice damage mitigation effect too. The Blind Aura is nuts, especially for you because you're not running Unwavering Stance. Your stun immunity comes from your Ascendancy, and so you actually can take full advantage of a Blind Aura like that. So it gives this nice defensive buff when you don't need the offensive buff, killing trash, but it gives a nice offensive buff when you fight bosses or particularly tanky rares. As well, you have another 10%. You can then go ahead and use Blood and Sand as the last 10% or a banner. Either one is totally reasonable. There's some pros and cons to each one. Probably Blood and Sand is the better overall option, just because it's going to give the biggest damage boost and it gives a nice clear boost, since it gives a more AoE aura effect when you're in Sand stance. So it's really, really flexible, but the burst of War Banner's Adrenaline is also really, really nice, and a lot of people like that a lot. If you end up scaling Impale at all too, then Dread Banner is great and also offers some pretty serious defenses as well, with the less accuracy aura that hits enemies, and the increased effect of Fortify when you place the banner is actually super strong as well. Anyway, Pride, Flesh and Stone plus Maim, link to Maim, and then either a banner or Blood and Sand. So once you clear out the reservation from vulnerability by getting that Impresence Amulet. So that's gonna be a huge boost reworking those auras. Absolutely massive. So if you have mana issues after reserving all that mana, there's a few things you can do to deal with that. So there's always the Enlighten Gem. Get a level 3 or 4 if you can afford it. Enlighten Gem, and then link that to Pride, and then Flesh and Stone Maim. And that should open up enough mana to feel comfortable. But if it doesn't, or possibly as an alternative, this might be enough all by itself. You can get minus mana cost of skills crafted on a ring, or as a, I believe it's an Elder mod on your chest. You could even combine that with these points right here, Tireless, which gives a percentage reduction to the mana cost of skills. The additive or subtractive minus mana cost of skills happens after this, I believe, and actually these nodes as well, if you take advantage of the decks on them as well, can contribute to some cost reduction. So somewhere between these things, you will hopefully free up enough mana to use all the different auras that I mentioned. Next thing I'll mention is your Flask setup. So I would currently recommend, and almost no matter what direction you go with this build, the Lion's Roar Flask. Lion's Roar is super strong. Any physical damage based build should be running melee physical damage based build should be running Lion's Roar. It's just too much damage to pass up unless you are super high attack speed or something, and the knockback is too obnoxious. But in the case of an Earthquake build, it's too perfect. You attack so slowly that it doesn't really hurt you all that much. The other thing is you may consider running an Onslaught Flask. It depends which different sort of like scaling path you go down, which again we'll talk about later. But you know, the attack speed and the movement speed boost are both really useful for utility and damage. In fact, movement speed scales your Veil Earthquake damage directly. So you know, the Onslaught effect is really, really powerful. You could also get it from a jewel, but then of course it's only up for just map clearing, but that might be fine depending on your preferences. Next thing I would say is you want to get rid of Veil Double Strike. I don't think Veil Double Strike is very worth running in your setup currently. It only has 2 damage links attached to it, which isn't going to give you that much. And instead you could run Veil Warchief. And I don't think you should run all 3, because then the demand for souls is going to be too high between Veil Warchief, Veil Double Strike, and Veil Earthquake. It'll just never be up in really, really tough boss fights, like an Uber Elder fight or something. And as well, you probably will get a similar amount of damage by just adding another damage link here that would impact your Veil Warchief rather than your Veil Double Strike. But the reason that you want Veil Warchief the most is because the more modifier on the skill that affects you is quite a bit higher with the Veil Warchief compared to the regular Warchief. So highly recommend going that route. Double Strike is, I think, kind of mediocre in your particular setup. The next thing you want to take a look at, I would say, is getting the last 2 endurance charges. So right now, you do not have the other Kaum's Way ring, but remember how much value you're getting out of your endurance charges. You get, 8% increased damage from your Ascendancy. You get 10% increased damage from the Tidebreaker. You get 4% more damage from the Tidebreaker's extra link. You get 4% chaos resistance. You get 5% physical resistance. You get so many benefits from running endurance charges that I think it's just too much value to pass up. Don't forget the regen that you get out of it. So many different stats that you get from that. So I would try to get your other Kaum's Way ring. You may be hurting for resistances right now, and that's not possible till you get better gear, and that's fine. But for the future, look toward that. And then eventually you'll want to get boots that also have +1 endurance charges to max endurance charges. You can get that through Death's Door, or you can just get corrupted boots. Whatever is more cost effective for you, either are pretty good options. I really liked Death's Door. I loved the bleed immunity. Granted, you have a lot of resistance to bleed as is, because you're a Jug that has a bunch of % fizz damage reduction, but nonetheless, I think that it's perfectly fine to get some kind of rare corrupted boot as well, or even some other unique that works okay. So if you continue down the path of what it looks like here, which is trying to keep a really high Veil Earthquake uptime with this Flask, first of all, you probably eventually want the upgrade to this Flask, which is really, really expensive. And may deter you from fully going in on the Veil Earthquake route. I still think Veil Earthquake is worth having and using, even if you don't go all in on it like that. But if you do plan on going that route, the Helm Enchant is going to be really, really good. So the Helm Enchant basically makes it so that you are able to start acquiring souls again for your Veil skills sooner, because the reduced duration that you can get from the Earthquake Helm Enchant stacks additively with the quality increases to your reduced duration gem, which is right here. So less duration as you add quality, right? You see it says 2% reduced skill effect duration. Again, that stacks additively, so it's really powerful with the Helm enchant. And the Helm enchant is something like 30% reduced duration for Earthquake. It's a really massive reduction to duration. So it works incredibly well if you're trying to have Veil Earthquake up all the time. The other thing that it does is it means you can scale your attack speed a lot harder without reaching that funny breakpoint where you start missing aftershocks, which is really key. You never want to go that high. So that's the next thing to consider. Another route you can consider is using the new support Shockwave. Shockwave is a really, really large boost to your damage if your attack speed is slow, because it has a high separate base damage of its own, but it's on a cooldown, and the cooldown, if I'm not mistaken, is 1 second by default, and then with like gem levels and quality gets to something like 0.7 or 0.8 seconds. So the point is, depending on what it is, you don't really want to be attacking much faster than like once a second, or maybe like 1.3 or 1.4 times a second, or whatever the breakpoint is, depending on the exact duration or the exact cooldown of that support. So if you go that route, then you actually don't even care about reducing duration at all. All of a sudden, you don't really want this. Pulverize synergizes incredibly well with it because you get a boost to your damage at the expense of attack speed, and now you have this other entirely different way of potentially scaling your damage, where you can just focus on absolutely massive hits at a really, really slow attack rate. So it's another route you can go. I'm not saying you should go that route, but just something you might want to keep in mind that you might want to play with. It's probably cheaper, at least, than going all in on Veil Earthquake is, because of how expensive that Flask is. And I have a feeling the Helm enchants for Earthquake are going to be more expensive than they normally are, which it's already kind of expensive to get. Let's see. The next thing to consider is jamming the Rage support in somewhere. So Rage support is one that gives a general boost to attack speed and attack damage and movement speed, which should scale pretty well if you can stack up Rage reasonably effectively. And so jamming that on something like Leap Slam in place of, let's say, Blood Magic, or even in place of Fortify if you end up moving this onto your main links, which is totally reasonable now. Fortify is actually a great option for Veil Earthquake because you don't have to worry about stopping to reset your Fortify. But anyway, so you could do it there. You could also throw it on a counterattack, like if you did Vengeance with Rage, then you're gonna get just this like free extra little bit of damage across a map. By the time you get to like map bosses and stuff, you'll probably actually be able to effectively stack your Rage up pretty good. So maybe in practice it won't work as well as I think it will, but I think it's going to be a pretty decent option for just getting sort of a free damage boost for just one gem. Like, it should give you more damage than like a golem or whatever, and people do use single gem slots for that all the time. Another place you can potentially get damage is the global physical damage boost on belts. It's a fossil mod. It's nothing insane, but I think it does go up to like 30% or so, so it's significant. Though I probably would try and get a life recovery rate belt over that, because that damage is going to be really modest, whereas the percent increased life recovery rate will be very, very noticeable with all the sustain you have, the regen and whatnot. And then finally, for your jewels, right, you can potentially get the Onslaught jewel like I mentioned earlier, but if you end up sticking with these regular jewels, which I think you should, Abyss jewels are not that great for this build. You don't really want more flat physical damage, you want percent increases for the most part. You're going to want to get attack speed, assuming that you don't go like the shockwave route that I mentioned earlier, and probably just percent global physical damage, since that scales both the hit and any bleeds that you inflict, which you have a little bit of bleed chance just from the vulnerability aura you're running. So let's go ahead and take a look at the tree, and I'm going to give you some suggestions here to refine the tree further. So for the tree, the first thing I would do is get rid of this. I really don't think investing 3 points to get what this estimates as 4% physical damage reduction is worth it. The problem is, too, this is a best case scenario. Any damage mods on a map or higher end maps are going to result in this being a significantly smaller amount of physical damage reduction, and you really don't have very much evasion. You have a tiny bit on one piece of gear, and then I guess whatever amount of evasion people naturally have on their character, but I don't think it's enough to bother investing in this Iron Reflexes node. Just save the points right here. Don't worry about going there. The other thing is it affords you the option of doing this, putting 2 points here, 2 points here, and then just you end up saving a point this way as well. So you actually potentially save 4 points, and this is for no loss in stats at all, right? What I just did was just saved 1 point, assuming that you don't need to go down here. There are other reasons to go down here, right? Like, this node is really good and worth considering for damage. It has damage and attack speed both, which is what you're going to want to really scale your damage, and it's got the AoE utility, so that's great. This is a potentially good path to go. Again, it's got the AoE utility on the nodes here, and then in the big node at the end, and then a pretty nice damage boost to hits against enemies on low life, and you can kind of think of that basically as being a third of the value of what it says, since it'll be up once enemies are at 35% life or below. So it's something like you're getting about 40% increased damage with that last node, which is pretty nice, in addition to all the utility of the AoE. So worth considering those as well. I don't think these are worth it. You're not going to cross that critical threshold of moving from, not being able to stun enemies to being able to stun lock them just with these few nodes. I don't think. You're welcome to try it. You can always unspec them if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's going to push you over the edge of, reliably stunning enemies that are like super endgame enemies. I think you generally want to take these nodes if you're running something like Ground Slam or Heavy Strike. I mean, granted, you are running a Tidebreaker, so maybe that's enough by itself, but I feel like you want to be heavily investing into stun before something like this gets a ton of value. You do have some investment, so you can experiment, but I wouldn't really recommend investing into that unless you really feel you need to. Going into these nodes is pretty darn good because Culling Strike is awesome, and I think even without investing here, with the Tidebreaker, with the stun duration nodes that you get here, all that kind of stuff, I think you will have decent stun uptime against tougher bosses. Maybe not like T15 bosses or anything like that, but I think you'll be culling a lot of enemies. Even some of the new tankier rares this league, I think you'll be culling them pretty decent amount of the time. So this is worth considering. I think these nodes are not worth taking. Maybe for right now, they're okay, but the problem with these nodes is that a lot of the value you get is the percent of Fizz damage leached as life, and you're running Blood Rage, which gives you more than enough to reach your leech cap. Maybe now, while your damage is on the lower side, these are actually doing something, or that stat is actually doing something, but later on, it's not going to provide you very much value because you're going to reach your leech cap without these, and you have tons of regen anyway, so you're not as reliant on leech as some other characters are. So I feel like this is for a different character than you. I feel like there are more efficient nodes to take. Like, I'd rather take these AoE nodes down here. So those are all considerations. Another thing you can consider, just in case you have trouble meeting your dex requirements is you can do this. Assuming you were going to fill this in anyway, you just move these 2 points from here to up here, and that just gives you an extra 10 points of dex, which, you know, might free up a slot on a piece of gear, something like that. So just a minor little tweak worth mentioning, depending on, you know, what your stat requirements are at various parts of the game. And then the final thing I would say as far as the tree goes is you may consider not investing heavily, but just putting a few points of investment into Impale or Bleed. Impale or Bleed are basically, they're kind of like more modifiers to your damage. Bleed, not exactly, but it still kind of is. And in particular, Bleed is really good with Earthquake because Earthquake has a really high base damage. So especially if you use the support Ruthless eventually, you can get really hard-hitting bleeds that actually contribute way more than you think to your damage. One of the reasons that, if you look at the build guide that I made, the Earthquake Jug, the tooltip, or the PoB damage and the tooltip damage are mediocre. They don't look very good, but I still killed the Uber Elder reasonably fast. It was like 315 or 320 kill or something, which is not insane, but it's reasonably fast, and I could have done better too. I just didn't play it all that well. But part of the reason that it was higher than it seemed is because of bleeds. Bleeds do just an absolutely massive amount of damage against enemies like that, where your damage uptime is low and you have to be dodging hits that you probably shouldn't take a lot, right? When you're having to circle around the enemy and all that kind of stuff. The damage is ticking away and has much higher damage uptime than your hits do. So it's kind of like your hits are suffering from, you know, a massive negative damage multiplier because your damage uptime is so low. So anyway, the point is that bleed helps more than it seems. So even just getting enough of a bleed chance to like have reliable uptime of bleeds against tougher bosses is pretty worth it. So something like just putting these few points in, right? You get that 30% plus 10% on, you know, from a reduced vulnerability effect against a boss, and bam, all of a sudden you keep pretty much 100% bleed uptime against an enemy, plus this augments attack damage and gives you a defensive benefit as well, and it gives a pretty significant boost to your damage. You would be surprised. So that's one option. You could also scale Impale a little bit. You could go put a few points into Bleed right there. You could scale Impale a little bit right there. All of them, like I said, are basically more modifiers, and, you know, if you run out of nodes that are offering additional utility, like I said, this has Culling Strike, this has AoE, this has AoE. If you're just starting to look at nodes that are like, these are just basic increases in damage, don't take those. Scale this stuff instead. This is going to do more for you because, again, you're no longer stacking onto this big pile of increases that offer diminishing returns, but you're now reallocating those resources to you know, basically a separate multiplier. And that's pretty much it. Those are pretty much my suggestions as far as getting your damage boosted here. If you have further questions about what to do, please go ahead and post them. I can offer some follow-ups, but hopefully this proves useful, and hopefully this kind of displays some of the ideas that I put forth in the big presentation I gave on scaling damage in the game. That was part of the idea behind this. And I would love to do this again. It's fun to go through people's builds and offer my suggestions. So anyway, best of luck to all of you in Legion, and I'll see you next time. Bye.